Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar on transition between studio and live environments presented by Mike Sutherland. My name is Mallory Misnarczyk and I'm the project manager here at Harman. A few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels during the webinar. However, there is a chat function where you can submit questions to the presenter and I'll try to answer as many as possible at the end. This webinar will also be recorded and a link will be made available a few days after this presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control. We encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions Workshop series on pro.harman.com, as well as visiting Harman Professional University to see our many on-demand and certification courses that are available to you for free. And now I'd like to introduce you to Mike Sutherland, the presenter for today's webinar. After attending Musicians Institute, Mike worked as the house engineer at Total Access Recording in California for 6 years. In 2012, he began touring as a front-of-house engineer. He is currently the tour manager and the front-of-house engineer for Sublime of Rome. And now I'll pass it over to you, Mike.
Hey, everyone. How you guys doing? As Mallory said, my name is Mike Sutherland. Currently, I'm the front-of-house tour manager for Sublime with Rome. And I've been working for them for about 2 years. As she mentioned also, I got my start at Musicians Institute in Hollywood back in 2004, and I've been working in the audio field ever since. So just a quick little objective for today. Some things I want to talk about are how we're going to, we're going to examine how the same tools and techniques can have differing applications in the studio and on the stage. Some of the challenges from going from the recording studio to the stage. So, for example, when I started, I had a lot of challenges kind of comprehending how to use compression and EQ in a live environment, given room, gain, stage, all of the challenges that come with doing a live show. And then I want to show some of the best practices when you go from the studio to the live environment, or things to think about when you transition. So as Mallory mentioned, I was a studio engineer before I became a live engineer. I have credits with Heaven and Hell, which is essentially the Ronnie James Dio fronted version of Black Sabbath. Produced, engineered, and mixed the band Pepper, Slightly Stupid, Pennywise. My live credits include Gwen Stefani at Monitors. I've been with Sublime with Rome for 2 years, on and off with them for about 5 as tour manager and front of house. I worked for Pepper before that, and I've also dabbled with Pennywise here and there whenever I'm available, and I'm able to help them out. So first and foremost, some of the benefits of both the recording studio and the live environment. For the studio, something that you really do have the benefit of is a controlled environment, something that, well, at least in most cases, you have a semi-controlled environment. You can control the room that you're recording in, the room that you're mixing in. You generally have a benefit of time, which, budgets are always taken into consideration when you talk about the benefit of time. The studio also allows for a lot of experimentation. I've spent 2 or 3 hours just trying to figure out what amp to use for one single guitar part. I mean, it's in the live world, that just doesn't happen. For the most part nowadays, given the advent of the DAW, channel count isn't really an issue, so you don't have to worry about how many tracks you're using necessarily. Some of the benefits of live, instant feedback, not the kind of feedback you're thinking of, but the feedback of having a crowd and hearing the response and the active energy that comes from mixing to 50, 100, 1,000, 2,000 people. You feel that energy coming back at you. And if you feel like everyone else is having a good time, it kind of, at least for me, it can settle me down and actually allow me to mix a little bit better. And you also, having a way of knowing exactly what your audience is hearing, whereas in the studio, you don't really have that, that benefit. I find that the live realm is really rewarding. It's kind of like a day job, whereas the studio, you're kind of in this weird, I don't know when I'm going to be done with this project kind of vibe. You have to do what you can when you can, and then the pressure can really improve your performance really quickly. I feel like having the pressure of, as I said, 150, 1,000 people, 2,000 people judging your work really pushes you to figure out, how to get better. Going over to the limitations of both. As I mentioned in the studio, you're mixing for so many different listening environments. Earbuds, car stereos, the radio. Nowadays, Bluetooth speakers are very prevalent. So I actually have a JBL little tiny USB speaker that I don't have handy that I use to reference mixes so that I can, have an idea of what someone might be listening to when they're listening to a mix at home. Also, it's really hard to tell when you're done when you're in the studio, especially when you're mixing. At least I have a hard time with that. In fact, yesterday I was mixing a song for an artist, and I got to the point in the mix where I was like, yeah, it's feeling good. I listened to it, and then I started working backwards. It felt like everything I did actually made it worse. And that's usually not a good sign, but it happens. I probably should have just stopped while I was ahead, but it's hard to tell when you're done. I mean, unless you have a time frame where you only have, and I've had these situations where you only have 5 hours, say. I've done sessions where the artist can only afford 5 days of studio time, and you're charged with mixing 10 songs in 5 days. Well, you essentially have about 6 hours per song to mix it, and you better just do it and get it done because the money's not there to actually let you just experiment. In live, room plays so much in your success. I mean, I can't tell you how many terrible rooms I've been in, whether it's the PA that you're working on, the actual room and how the room sounds, boomy, loud, live, low ceilings. All these things are things that you have to deal with as a live engineer. Signal to noise is a constant battle. And when I say signal to noise, I mean, your ratio of the noise that's occurring in the mic naturally. And in this case, my kids are actually in the other room making a ton of noise, and I hope that my microphone has enough signal from me talking so that you don't actually hear that. The live realm has a real strict time schedule. You don't have time to truly experiment. If you do, it's usually in a rehearsal setting, and even major artists don't necessarily have the budgets to spend hours on hours experimenting in a rehearsal setting because you're paying for studio time, or for the rehearsal studio time, the audio rental, the engineer, my time, your guitar tech's time. So time isn't really on your side in the live studio. So in both situations, I've noticed that my success is so based on the player, the source, and the song. If you have a bad song, it's going to be hard to make your mix sound good. It's just the way it is. If you have a bad player, it's going to affect how you mix. If you have a good player, it's going to be so easy to get something out of that person. If you're, in my opinion, if you're constantly turning something down in a mix, whether it's in the live environment or the studio environment, probably not needed, and it's probably no good. It's just a really good sign that, like, hey, you know what, this part isn't working. We should look into it a little bit further. So remember, sometimes your success in both instances have a lot to do with the player, the source being the guitar, the amp, the microphone, and of course the song. A good song will always be easier to mix than a bad song. One of the things that I love about working with Sublime with Rome is the band plays classic Sublime songs that are all really good songs. And it actually makes my job really easy because I love the songs, and they just come together really well because the songs were written and produced and recorded well to begin with, and so they're generally easier to mix. Now, going into more technical side, the gain structure in both environments is so different, in my opinion. For the studio, most of the time, I am maximizing the level going to my digital audio workstation. And the reason being maximizing your bit depth and getting as much out of those converters as you can. Back in the day, if you were maximizing your level on tape, you'd saturate the tape and you'd actually get like a really cool tape saturation sound that many plugins try to emulate now. So gain structure has always been a little bit on the hotter side for the studio. Whereas in live, you have so many different layers of gain, whether it's the preamp from the microphone to the console, to your master fader bus, to any type of additional gain that you're adding on a compressor, to the amps that you're using for your actual PA. You could be on a tiny little single speaker rig for a backyard band, and if you don't have enough gain going to your speaker, it's going to be hard to get enough gain out of the mic pre to get enough level out. So the way I think of gain in the live environment is it's used to control headroom. So I don't want my master fader going absolutely nuts. I don't want to have to bring my master fader down too much. You know, here and there I'll do it occasionally. So what I end up doing is I'll set my PA up. I'll get the level that I want out of the PA using like a reference track or even pink noise sometimes. And I'll use the vocal and the kick drum as my two sources to set my gain. And then I kind of build everything around it. A lot of people don't like this method, mainly because it affects how your thresholds are set up for your compression. Personally, I'm going to reset my compression thresholds almost every day anyway. I'm not a set it and forget it. I think most engineers who are set it and forget it because of the digital technology in consoles, I think they're being lazy, and they're not actually, you know, actively taking a role in their job. You need to be able to look at those thresholds and adjust for them. Sometimes my kick level is exactly where I want it when I pull up a console file. Sometimes it's not. It just depends on the room I'm in, the PA that I'm currently working on. If you have the luxury of using the same PA, generally your gain structure doesn't change. You know, I did an entire summer tour on a JBL A12 rig last year, and I didn't really change my gains that much because I knew every day where, for the most part, my level was going to be because we were using JBL gear. It just is the way that it works, and it actually helps out immensely. Moving on to the dynamics section, I look at gates and compression so differently amongst the two, mainly compression, but gates I do see a difference in the two environments. First and foremost, the studio, I don't actually use gates that often. I'll use them as effects on occasion. For instance, a gated reverb, if I want to recreate like that classic 80s gated reverb sound. I'll use them to duck things on occasion in the studio. But with the advent of the DAW, I've kind of moved more into the automation rules all, you know, delete audio clips, you know, that where there's nothing going on. You know, I'm very, very particular about a vocal track. If I go through a vocal track, I'll make sure that I'm only listening to audio clips that have actual vocals in them, and I trim every aspect of them to keep the noise at a minimum. For toms in the studio, I'll actually automate my fader moves to match when a tom has been hit and closes, and it gives me a lot more accuracy, and I can do each individual tom hit. Whereas in a gate, you can't do that unless you want to sit there, which is not really feasible. You can't really sit there and go back and forth between the two. So it gives me more flexibility to just automate my toms. In the live realm, I use them immensely. It helps me control so much, especially on the drums. I'll even use a gate or two on a vocal if I can. It helps with my signal to noise and allows me to really carve out an area where there's no noise. You know, my drummer on Sublime with Rome thankfully hits really hard, and so if I can get a good gate setting on him, I can get the toms really loud and decay in the way that I want them to without, one, adding too much low end to my mix and, you know, having a little bit of subharmonic reach feedback into the microphones. And I can help with the signal to noise, whereas if he's bashing on a cymbal, you know, and I tend to add a lot of 10K to my toms to get them to punch through. That boosts up those cymbals immensely. So if you don't have a gate on those, before you add that EQ, you're going to have a lot of trouble with cymbal bleed. But again, that's also dependent on the player, because if you don't have a drummer that hits hard, adding a gate and boosting 10K only makes the cymbals sound washy, and you'll get a lot of that in your mix, and it's sometimes not useful. So again, it goes back to that initial idea that most important is the player and the song. Moving on to compression, in the studio, I love compression, and one of the hardest things for me going from the studio to the live realm was utilizing compression, because I tend to use a lot of it. And in my early days as a live engineer, after having 6 or 7 years in a studio working with other engineers and seeing how they compressed their sources, what you end up with is probably more compression than you need for the live realm. So I use in the studio, I use the compression for color and level control, real basic level control, mostly for color and to really allow things to pop out of the mix. And again, it's not needed as much with the advent of automation, at least the type of automation that you can do in a DAW. You can really control a vocal with automation almost better than you can with a compressor, unless you want, like I said, the color and the harmonic characteristics that come with applying a lot of compression to a vocal or a drum or a bass or a guitar. In the live realm, I use it almost strictly as level control. It's not something that I use to color my sources per se. For instance, on Sublime with Rome, Rome happens to be a fairly quiet singer in some instances. And so with him, he actually has his guitar directly behind him and 2 wedges directly in front of him. So I get a lot of bleed coming through his microphone when we're performing live. So what ends up happening is I'll adjust my compression so that I'm only compressing his vocal in his loudest moments. So if he has a few instances where he'll really lean into the mic and provide a lot of level, and in an effort to keep my fader from having to just jump back down, I'll compress that part, and everything below that, I'll find basically like the middle ground, like, okay, this is kind of where he's at, and then if he goes above this threshold, the compressor will kick in, and depending on the performer, you can adjust your ratio to how much compression is actually applied. I typically like 3 or 4 to 1 for a vocal, and that'll just bring him down enough that I don't need to worry about bringing up bringing down the fader, excuse me. And it also allows me to keep the ambient noise around him much quieter, and it really helps. One of the things that I'll show you in just a second is how I work on guitars. In most of the music that I work on, a lot of the guitars there's a lot of skanks, and the chicks, like chick, it's reggae, and it's that kind of one-drop reggae feel with the skank guitar. Well, people tend to lean into those skanks more than they lean into the rest of their guitar tone. And so I have to control those skanks so that they're not too loud or too piercing. And I do that with compression. So on Sublime with Rome, he only uses a 2-channel cab, essentially, a clean and a dirty. And it's only 1 guitar amp, so he's not switching, so I don't have 2 microphones. So what I'll do is I'll set my compression to only compress when he's doing those chicks, and I'll set my threshold by going to my distortion, and I shouldn't be compressing anything when he's on distortion. And what that does is it brings up the level of the distortion and brings down the level of those loud, kind of bright and brittle guitar chicks that he does. When it comes to sidechain compression, I don't use it as much in the studio, but there are certain circumstances where it's used real creatively. For instance, the EDM realm, using a sidechain to control your level and how things can, for instance, a kick drum, kind of reducing the level of the rest of a mix to kind of give it a pumping feel. I'm sure you've heard that in many different recordings. In the live realm, I use it to duck my bass from my kick drum. It allows me to maximize the subwoofer response so that when my kick is hitting, I'm not completely wearing out the driver. So by having this bass just provide a lot of reggae is low end driven and has a lot of sustaining low end. So something along those lines. And if you've got the bass really loud and you try to push a kick through there, your driver literally has nowhere to go. Like your driver's maxed on your subs. So by ducking, it reduces the pressure that's being put on your driver and can allow the kick drum to have a little bit more punch. When it comes to multiband, I love multiband compression on vocals in both the studio and the live realm. I don't really use it quite as much in the studio, but I do find it's really, really helpful in the live environment because some sources don't take EQ that well. For instance, vocals. It allows me to have a vocal that's really upfront and has a lot of low end, but when the low end is really brought forward, you know, via a somebody coming up on a mic and having that proximity effect kind of take over the sound of the microphone, you know, instead of using a high pass, you can use a multiband to kind of reduce the low end so that when he's off the mic or she is off the mic, you still have some body in there and it's not completely lost. And that to me is really helpful. So again, for the dynamics example, if you can see, there's a little line right here. This is your gain reduction. This is the UI 24 that I've pre-recorded here, and this is an acoustic guitar coming through. And you'll see that when the chicks are hitting, you'll actually see the gain reduction happening, but not until then. So. And you'll see those green lines kind of hitting only on those hits. I don't think you can hear this, but you might be able to. And I know the audio may not be the greatest, but really the idea is to see only those loud parts being compressed. And that's my example for in the live realm. And that's how I compress guitars, for instance, in that live environment. Moving on to the EQ, there's a few different ways of EQing, in my opinion. There's additive, there's subtractive, and there's a lot of use of the high pass in the live environment. When it comes to the high pass in the studio, it's useful in certain circumstances. I do use it to control low end, just, you know, on toms or a snare drum, just cleans it up a little bit. I don't see it as necessary because you can control so much, especially if you're, for instance, recording a live band and you have a lot of bleed. You know, sometimes you could use a high pass to reduce the amount of bleed that would come in from a bass amp or a kick drum, but you can also just erase the section of the clip that's not using it. So it's, like I said, it's useful. However, it's not as necessary to me as it is in the live environment. To me, it's used on everything where extended low end is not needed. Extended low end being anything below 90 hertz, 100 hertz, around there. So that's one of the first things I do when I build a console file is I'll actually just put in if I've never worked with a band, my first file will be the input list plus, you know, maybe a little bit of gain, an idea of what I might do on EQ, and then I'll add a high pass to everything that's needed. So the only things that don't really get high pass in my environment are a bass guitar and a kick drum, and some low floor toms, depending on how well the drummer hits and the type of floor tom and whether my drum tech can actually tune the drum to make it, you know, sound good. So I don't use it as much in the studio. However, it can be very, very useful in a live environment. Now, additive EQ is something that is really interesting. So to me, additive EQ is just literally, if you're looking at an EQ, is adding, you know, +6 of 2K. Subtractive being subtracting or taking -6 of 2K. To me, in the studio, I don't find that an additive EQ can be detrimental to a mix so much as it can be detrimental in the live environment, because you add a lot of, I mean, the whole idea is control in live and getting everything above a noise floor and making sure everyone can hear. So if you're adding a lot of EQ, to me, there's something else going on in the mix that isn't right. And in the studio, it can really help shape a sound. It can add a life or air, as they say, on some of those MOG EQs. But with it, with the live environment, to me, it adds too much. And you can use it to make things louder and appear closer and in the mix, but it just doesn't work as well for me as subtractive, because I find that if I've got my gain set properly and my system tuned and my source sounding the way I want it to, like to start, I don't need as much additive EQ in the live environment. Plus, it also introduces more opportunity for feedback in certain sources, for instance, the vocal. So I try to definitely avoid it in a vocal. I'll add it in a tom, as I mentioned earlier, where, you know, I want the toms to stick out a little bit and get above, you know, a few things without having to have all the boom and the low mids. Kind of punches through, especially in punk rock. When I'm working for Pennywise, you know, you have a distorted guitar just going 100 miles an hour, and when those toms fly by, it's hard to get them above that distorted guitar when they take up so much space in your mix. So by adding a little bit of 10K, I can get them above the guitar and allow them to kind of cut through. One of the things I love about the live environment and has made me a better mixer in general, in both, is being able to EQ while listening to the entire mix. To me, it's so invaluable because it allows you to actually hear the whole mix clearly. It's less about, you know, soloing an individual part and listening to the sum of all of those parts. And I didn't really do that until I started mixing live. I was a pretty heavy solo the guitar, listen to it, EQ it, and put it in the mix. And now I find that it's actually easier for me to EQ when I'm listening to the entire mix. And the reason being, it allows me to hear the whole sonic picture. So if you have let's see, if I want to add a little, for instance, if I want to add a little bit of top end to my toms over that distorted guitar, one of the best ways to know how much top end to add is to listen to it with the guitar. So if I'm listening to my whole mix and I can make those adjustments, it really helps. And I've tried to transition and move that same idea into mixing in the studio. Just something to consider. Here's a quick EQ example for what I do on a vocal. This kind of sums up my subtractive EQ. If I don't have enough level, it generally means I don't want to add anything. I want to turn my gain up. So if it's not bright enough, I would rather add a little bit more gain and bring down the parts that I don't want than add 10K to my vocal, because it's just introducing a whole, you know, set of gain that I don't want. And it's semi-artificial gain. So you can see here, one thing I'll do is I'll take this third band here and just kind of sweep around and find the frequency that I don't want and then bring it back down. And the sweep to me is really important because, generally speaking, if you have a source and you're hearing something that you don't like, you know, I've never been one to study frequencies, maybe because my training in the studio didn't require me, going back to that whole solo idea, didn't require me to have to hear a frequency right away and identify it and bring it down like you would in a live environment. So I found that sweeping worked really, really well. in the studio. I could find exactly what I didn't like and then bring it down. And generally speaking, if you add 15 decibels to an EQ and you sweep across, if you're not hearing it all of a sudden just jump out, it's probably not too much of it. But if it jumps out immediately, that's generally what you're looking for. It's a great quick way to identify frequencies that are taking up too much space in your source. So I'll do this at sound check. I obviously won't do it at a live show because you don't want to sweep across a frequency band in front of, 5,000 people. Just wouldn't be a pretty sound. But going with the lack of time and how much or how little time you have in the live environment, sometimes I'll only get 20 minutes to line check and no band. So it's just me and my guitar techs and my drum tech working through it. And if I don't have that time, then I'll just go with this method, and I can pretty much pinpoint what I need very quickly and without too much workaround. So when you go on to effects, effects to me are pretty funny in both circumstances. I think of them as just spatial elements. It's the only reason that you add effects is to push a source forward or push a source back, or to create an environment that is not the natural environment that the source is in. So if you don't have a really good drum room, and you're not recording drums in a big room, you'll add room to mimic the sound of being in a drum room. So to me, it's all cleaning, and it's all little tiny microscopic fixes to a mix that can like bring a whole lot of depth. So in the studio, you get to define the space that your instrument is in, or your source, and you can do that with reverb, with delay, like I said, the drum room's example. And you can actually use a lot of automation to maximize your effects. Something that I actually do a little bit of live. For reverbs in particular, if you want a longer tail on a reverb in a studio environment, a good way to add that long tail without making a complete mess of your mix is by automating your vocal and your send level so that you can hit tails on the end of phrases or words, and you keep your send level lower and you kind of boost it up, and you hit that tail, and it allows the reverb to get hit with a louder input, and keeps the rest of your mix at a level that's a little bit more maximized, as opposed to setting and forgetting. In the live environment, reverbs and delays, you have to factor in the room that you're in. You can't, if I'm outside and there's zero reverberation, I'll definitely add some reverb to some sources to give it some space, and so it's not a dry, complete, mix. If I'm in a room that is boomy and large and has a ton of space, you can guarantee that I'm not going to add any effects or as much effects to my sources. So it all depends on the room that you're in. You have to think about that and how everything kind of plays into it. In my experience, delay actually adds a lot more than reverb, especially when it comes to vocals in the live environment. And just like I mentioned, the automation on reverbs and delays for the studio, something that I am very, very fond of is automating my effect send to my delays. With Sublime with Rome and most reggae acts, the RE20 Space Echo, RE201 for the original tape machine, is a big part of the sound of the band. So I use it almost exclusively as my delay on most of the bands that I mix that are in that genre. And what I do is I'll set my aux master on a VCA, and most of my mixing in the live environment is done on VCAs. So aux 8 or aux 16, the master will be assigned to whatever VCA is the last VCA in my bank of VCAs. Some consoles have 8, some consoles have 16. Whatever's the last one, I'll assign that as my effect send to my delay. And during the show, I can add so much space and delay based on where they are in the song, how he's singing. I can then ride my vocal VCA up and down depending on how much delay and how much space I want to give him between it. And it really gives me a lot more control over my effects. You could do the same thing with reverbs. I just tend to use it with delay. But I think it's invaluable to have more control over your effects in the live realm than people think. It's not a set it and forget it situation, which is why having scenes and going through and doing that legwork where you have scenes for each scenario. It's really important to do that so you have different effects for different songs. Most of the bands I work for don't require that sort of automation because they're more just like punk rock and rock, and it's not as necessary. There's not a lot of changing parts or changing levels or vibes. And for the parts where they do change in vibe, I have enough control over my delay to affect it and make it a little bit better. The other thing I love about the 201 and the RE20, it's a space echo pedal, is it allows me to have control over my feedback and my delay time at my fingertips. I can put it on my console, I can put it on a table to the side of me, it doesn't really matter. But essentially, having the tactile ability to add feedback or repeats, if you will, right there, I can, it also has a 2-band EQ, just highs and lows, and I can affect that delay so many different ways that you would think that I'm changing delay scenes, if you will, from song to song, but I'm not. I'm actually just in real time adjusting my delay, and I find that the pedal actually gives me a lot more sonic real estate than if I were using a rack unit or a plug-in within the console. And the reason being is, again, I have control over it right there at my fingertips. It's 4 knobs. It's got a tap tempo. I can tap exactly what kind of delay I want. And depending on the kind of delay hit that I'm giving, whether it's an effect hit like a space echo dub sound, with a lot of repeats, again, I have control over what syllable or word is affected by that. And it really adds a lot to my mixes, in my opinion. And I think if you have the opportunity to play around with a VCA or just being able to modify your aux master and ride that aux master while you're mixing, you'll find it adds a lot of depth and allows you to really play with the sources in your mix. So for panning, this one I actually kind of learned the hard way. I was in the studio, and I love panning for clarity and for creativity and getting that space. Guitars hard panned if you double them, and toms moving entirely across the sonic spectrum. And when I started mixing live, I had a problem with that because I didn't realize how I was so set on space in relative to the phantom center and being in the center of a mix. Well, in the live environment, you are not mixing for a person sitting in the center. You're mixing for people on the left of the house, on the right of the house, in the back, and you have to take those people into consideration. So panning can be really useful in the studio and create a lot of space and allows you to have a lot of real estate, whereas in the live environment, it's not as helpful. It can actually be detrimental. So my example is I had my guitar hard panned to the left when I started mixing live. Somebody from house right came over and said, "Can you turn the guitar up?" I'm like, "What the hell are you talking about? It's loud." Wait, it's not loud. It's only loud for the people on the left side of the house. And so now I'll position my guitar opposite of where it is on the stage. So if my guitar player is on the right stage right side of the stage, I'll position it on the opposite side in the mix just slightly, because generally speaking, in this instance where we have a live cabinet on stage, those people are getting hit with enough guitar, not as necessary. But this allows those people on the right to get a little bit more balance, and it also leaves a little bit of space in the middle for my vocal and the rest of the instruments taking up that center space. I will still pan toms, and I will, for some reason, an engineer that I learned from who actually taught me a lot, his name is Sean Wisner. He's the front of house engineer for the Dirty Heads. He pans his timbali all the way to the house right side. And I've just always done that, and it does separate the timbali from the rest of the kit. There's really no confusion amongst the snare and the timbali that way. So just something that I've noticed. Something that is really useful when you're in the studio or in the live environment and you have the ability to do this. As I mentioned, I don't have the ability to do this with Sublime with Roam. Dave Ratt has a great video on YouTube explaining how comb filtering and miking one source with multiple mics can affect your comb filtering. So in essence, if you have one source and one microphone hitting two speakers, those two speakers are going to naturally comb filter out because it's the same source out of the two different speakers hitting the walls and coming together and creating that comb filter effect that I'm sure most of you are aware of. His technique is to place two microphones on one source, or even two sources in some cases, and pan those microphones hard left and hard right. And that eliminates the comb filtering because you now have two different sources and they don't have the same kind of up and down, God, I can't think of the term right now, I'm blanking, but it allows you to have less comb filtering, essentially, and it's really useful. I use it on Pennywise. Fletcher, the guitar player for Pennywise, is kind of a sound nerd himself, and he loves the method, and I think it's awesome, and it really does allow you to have, if you have one guitar player, you can hard pan that, you know, as hard as you want because you have, you know, one source with two different microphones. It's even better with two sources. With Fletcher, we have two different amps on stage, and I can mic both of them and pan them hard. Dave, I'm pretty sure, does it with John Frusciante, or did do it with John. I guess John's back in the band now, but of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So that's how I think of panning in both of those environments. So in conclusion, the way I like to compare the two is to think that in the studio, creativity and freedom definitely rule. You have a lot more ability to experiment and mess around and try things. And some of those techniques that you can experiment in the studio, you can actually take into the live realm. When it comes to mixing in the studio, though, you're mixing for permanence. It's going to live forever. So there's a little bit more pressure for the mix to be right or perfect or, you know, good. And that has consequences. So you want to, one, mix for multiple environments, how people are listening, earbuds, yada, yada, yada. With the live environment, in my opinion, technical skill and control rule. If you can control your mix, you're actually probably doing a better job than someone who is letting, you know, creativity rule the roost. I can speak from experience that having a lot of creativity and trying different things and over-compressing doesn't actually control your source. It doesn't, I'll never forget, mixing, it was a very, very strange situation, but we were playing a rodeo, and I was in the worst possible mix position, and the speakers were in the round, and the band was on a rotating stage in the center of the rodeo ring. And the band would rotate every, you know, minute and a half and then rotate back around. And the speakers were nowhere near where I was. And I couldn't figure out why my level, I didn't have the level and the loudness that I wanted. And it came down to the fact that I was using a bus compressor on my master bus like I would normally in a studio, and to get that like punchy kind of growl, but I wasn't adding any additional gain on top of the reduction. It was just reducing my mix. And as soon as I let up the threshold on that compressor, my mix came to life. And I mean by control. You know, you can definitely be creative in the studio environment, but you have to consider all the things that make live sound live. The other thing is mixing for the moment in the live environment. At the end of the day, you're kind of like a pitcher in that, you know, if you have a bad show, let it go, move on to the next one. You know, you got another one tomorrow, most likely, if you're on tour, or if you're working in a club. You got another one in a couple days. You just go for the next show. You want it to be great, but at the same time, that allows you to kind of take the lessons that you learn in one day and just immediately move on and apply those lessons the next day. I'll never forget mixing, my third day mixing, and I had kind of a, I got called into the live environment by Pepper. I was a studio engineer that they knew and loved, and their longtime front of house guy decided that he would rather go home and spend his days in Hawaii, which is where he's from, than live in a tour bus. And I don't really blame him. That's a pretty good life that he's living right now, surfing every day. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I had my first show at Red Rocks, believe it or not. Thankfully, Pepper was smart enough to hire somebody that they knew, who happened to be Sean Wisner, the front of house engineer for the Dirty Heads, who I mentioned earlier. He was mixing the support band. We were direct support. And they had Sean, who had previously mixed Pepper and they'd known for a long time, teach me the ropes. Sean didn't really think that was fun until he kind of figured out that I knew what was, you know, what a compressor was and how it worked, and I wasn't a complete noob. But for the next 3 days, he was with us and on tour with us and could show me how to take these exact skills that I've been telling you and transition from that studio environment to the live environment. And there was a day in Houston where we were playing an amphitheater, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's an aluminum or steel roof, and it is the loudest room, and it's just like mixing in a fishbowl. It's just swimming everywhere. And Sean basically looked at me and he goes, "Move on to the next one. That was a horrible show. Move on to the next one." And that has always stuck with me because it was really, really valuable advice. Being able to mix for that moment, take what you learn and move on and just do it again tomorrow. You know, conversely, I have a really hard time listening to mixes that I've mixed for bands until years later. I just can't do it. I hear all the imperfections and the flaws. And one of the nice things about that live environment is that mix is done. The only people that were there were the ones that heard it. And you can move on and learn from it and get better. And that's something that I think everyone should take into consideration as they start to mix live. And that kind of concludes my slideshow. So if you guys would like, here's my contact info, and I'm ready to take some questions.
Thank you, Mike, for presenting. I don't see any questions yet. If anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat box. In the meantime, I am going to share 3 links in that chat box as well with everyone. Okay. The first link is to our Harman Professional University, so you're able to access thousands of hours of our curriculum, content, and certification. This link will give you an overview of information and will get you to the registration page to sign up. The second link is for our playlist on YouTube of all our webinar recording sessions, and the third is for our calendar of upcoming webinars. Let me check if we had any questions come in. Okay, we do have one. Okay. In live streaming, are we using live studio techniques? And then a second question on that is, what should we use from one realm and avoid from the other?
This is a great question, and it's super timely. I've been doing a few live streams recently, and it's actually a bit of a mixture of both in my experience. So Sublime Chrome did a live stream a week and a half ago, and we did it at our bass player's house on his balcony. And it was outside. There was 0 room. So taking the effects into consideration, I had to create a space for the band to live in since we were outside and it was dry and I didn't have the ability to add room mics. so I kind of thought in that studio realm in that way, but I also had to have a little bit more control. So for instance, the example about him singing softly and having too much bleed in his microphone from his guitar, I can't overcompress his vocal because even in the streaming environment and the live environment, although it's a little bit more controlled in the streaming environment, I still need to make sure that I'm not blowing the whole mix out by overcompressing and bringing up the level of all of his guitars. And then can you repeat the second half of that question?
Yeah, of course.
Melanie?
It says, would we use from one realm and avoid one from the other? Or sorry, what should we use from one realm and avoid from the other?
I would definitely take your compression into consideration for the live stream from the live environment, and think of it in that way, again, because of the way that signal to noise plays a part. Now, if you have, and that's only if you're doing it like it's a live show. So if you're doing a live stream from a recording studio and you have the ability to isolate drums and you have the ability to isolate your singer and you have the ability to isolate your guitar amps and everything, my inclination would be to treat it more as a studio environment because that's essentially what you have. So with that in mind, I would treat almost the entire situation as a studio session. And in the situation that I was in last Saturday, where I had a band on a tiny patio with bleed everywhere and zero ambient room, it was more of a live show for me. So it depends on the environment and the way that the setup is, how it's been set up.
This is Scott Wood from Soundcraft. Let me chime in here also. If people have a UI-24, a lot of streaming mixing is about who your audience is and what you're presenting to the audience. What's the content? What's the audience? And do you have some people live and you're also streaming, or are you just doing streaming or are you just doing live? So that's kind of like the back end. The nice thing about something like a UI-24 is you can set up your auxes as matrices, and you can dedicate. You go through your subgroups, and from your subgroups you can go to your master mix or to the matrices and adjust the balances relatively. And the other thing about the sources is, are they singing or is it 2 or 3 people talking? If it's 2 or 3 people talking, UI-24 has something called auto mix, and it's very much focused on speech. It's the type of thing that they use in broadcast, where it allows you can adjust for the strongest voice or the weakest voice. What it does is it really brings down the other mics that are not most prominent at the moment, which keeps your noise floor down. Your noise floor you're going to notice more in streaming than you are in a live concert. In live concert, there's lots of noise, and it's about getting a dynamic range of your content above the noise, but below damage. I guess that's a good way of putting it. Streaming is different. You really have to worry about your noise floor in streaming.
Absolutely.
Great. We do have a couple more questions. The next one is, would you recommend using the delay RE20 feedback on itself in studio or live environment?
So the question being, would I use it for both, or is that the question? Yeah,
so feedback on itself in studio or live entertainment, or I'm assuming both then.
I use the feedback, and if I don't answer this correctly, please ask it again so I can understand just better. But for the studio, I actually use the RE20 a lot, and I do the same thing. The only difference is I record the return so that I have, if it's a live performance, I'm thinking of myself as a mixer or as a source, and I'll record the return of the RE20 back into whatever my DAW is, and that allows me to kind of perform in the same way and capture that. And I think that's what you're asking, and if you're not, please ask it again, and maybe I can clarify.
Great. So more coming in. So in live, do you use bus compression at all, or only individual channels?
I do use bus compression. However, it's slight, and I actually use I take a bus compressor with me for most gigs. It lives in a fly rack, and it's a Dramastic Audio Obsidian. And the cool thing about it is it has a high-pass filter before the threshold sensor that you can engage. And so one of the problems that I've experienced in with bus compression live is you have a lot of low-end source material because you want your live show to have that punch and that low-end energy. And what ends up happening is your bus compressor gets triggered by the low end from a kick drum or a bass when you don't necessarily want it to be triggered by that. So with the Dramastic, I can actually use that high pass before the sensor to focus my sensor so that it's only hitting like 3 to 4 dB of reduction on like a snare drum or a vocal. That's it, kind of as a glue in that sense. I've used Dramastic in the studio as well. It was actually developed for the studio, but I find it's really, really useful live because if you just put a standard bus compressor on there and you have a lot of low-end energy, as we do with Sublime with Rome, like it gets triggered by all that low end and doesn't allow the clarity. So yes, the answer is yes, I do.
Great. Next question is, if you were mixing a track in a live show, which you had previously mixed in a studio, how closely would you mix the recorded track?
I've actually have experience with this, and I mix it as even if I haven't recorded or mixed it, I'd mix it as close to the album as possible. People, unless the artist has the intent of making it sound different than the record, people are there to experience the record live. And one of the benefits of working for bands like Sublime with Rome and Pennywise is I'm a fan of both of those bands, and I have been since I was a kid. And so I know all of the songs. And for Sublime with Rome, I can actually trigger delays that are on the record because I know the record so well. So in every instance, I try to make the record translate to a live, or try to make the live experience translate to a representation of the live record.
Great. We have a couple more. So the next question is, when advancing to front of house mixing, have you felt tempted to take your studio effects, such as wave plugins or 19-inch racks, to the front of house environment? Or do you use deck internal processing only?
I've done, as I mentioned, I take a rack with me for my compressor, my bus compressor. I also have a Midas EQ that I take with me that's got XL4 mic pre's, so it allows me a little bit more consistency when I'm mixing on consoles in clubs. So I will take those. I do use waves live. Depending on the scenario. In some cases, waves can be really, really risky, and you should always have some, a backup plan in place, whether it's like an abort waves, cue or macro that you have so that you can abort all your waves plugins. But I do use waves live, but I keep it as little as possible. I don't want my mix to be reliant on either my rack gear or my plugins. And the reason being is if you are doing a fly show, for instance, and your rack doesn't show up, or you do a fly show and the audio company that provided the console either didn't bring a waves server or has a really, really spotty waves server that doesn't seem to want to communicate, even if it works once, I'm not going to use it because I don't want to take a risk. And so if I'm reliant on those things, I tend to avoid them. Scott, looks like you have something to add to that.
Oh, I mean, live shows are about dealing with what you have.
Yep.
I often talk about live compared to studio as live is a lot of preparation in for just your skills and your gear, as well as trying to figure out what artists you're going to be working with. But once the show starts, it's about dealing with it. Mm-hmm. And you might have a cable go bad. I mean, cable tips are notoriously the worst thing that you have to deal with. It's about dealing with it and trying to keep, I often joke about live sound is about getting people dancing and keeping people dancing. And if I don't get exactly what I want, the real question is, are they getting exactly what they want?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we have a couple more that keep coming in. So we'll do a couple. Do you have any tips you can give to mix a DJ deck on live?
DJ deck on Studio Live? On live?
It just says on live.
I think we're talking about DJ mixing and doing playbacks and sweeps and stuff like that.
Could be. Do us a favor, ask that question, maybe elaborate on the question so maybe I can take a better shot at it. I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, great. We'll see if the person that put in the question adds on to that. So the next question is, have you ever tried inserting DAW into Live Rig and using low latency plugins? Do you think this could be useful?
I've actually done this, yes. I've only used it for time-based effects, for time-based, effects like reverb and delay. I had a scenario in Hawaii with Pepper where, when you're on an island, the resources are limited, and the audio company could only provide a monitor console with just an analog monitor console. There were 0 effects on board. They didn't provide any effects. And so I happened to take my my recording interface with me to do some recording for Pepper while we were on the island, which is where they're from. And I inserted in order to get effects, I just sent my effects to my DAW and use them that way. And that's absolutely, if you have the auxiliaries and you have the outputs, you could definitely do that. I don't see a problem with it. I would not rely on it if you don't have an interface that has really, really low latency. And I try to limit it to effects and not like EQ and compression.
Great. So that looks like all the questions that did come through. If anyone has any additional questions, you can reach out to Mike directly. I want to thank you, Mike, for your time presenting today, and thank you, everyone, who joined us.
Thank you guys so much. Please feel free to email me. I will get back to you as soon as possible if you do.
Perfect. Great. I hope everyone has a good afternoon. Bye.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye.